Hello, fellow bookish people. Today I come to you with a review of Binti, the Night Masquerade, the third in a novella series of science fiction, Afrofuturism, coming-of-age story of young Binti, a Himba woman who uh, travels from her home, the Himba people in Africa, people who are very connected to the land and don't particularly, don't leave the land. It's a very kind of taboo thing to do that. She leaves them to travel to Umba University, which is an interstellar university full of aliens and stuff like that. But in the first book, that goes that things do not go as expected. She ends up encountering the Maydu, a very kind of warlike, 9 foot tall, 5 foot wide jellyfish kind of like creatures with all these tentacles, and things go really off the rails right from the start. I think in that first novel, you get the thing of like, we're not doing your kind of typical, oh, this is going to be an adventure and it's all just going to kind of flow how you expect it's going to flow. In the second book, we've suddenly skipped over all the kind of like the kind of a cool fantasy or science fiction, oh, I'm at school kind of stuff, to say, no, I need to go home. I need to go, because Binti is she's really changed and messed up from her experiences, and has to go home, and ends up going home with one of the Maydu who she's made friends with, Oku. So she goes home to try and kind of to square things, to find, because she's filled with all this rage, and there are more complications. This is a book where I think a lot of young adult novels, you kind of come to these things and it's like you're going to get pat answers, or things are going to get kind of, there's a conservative element to a lot of YA fiction, I feel. And this is a book all about how things aren't simple. Things are going to get more complicated, and you're going to have to question yourself more and more often. And indeed, she finds multiple layers of her being, of being Himba, ending up being kind of initiated somewhat unwillingly into the Maydu. She encounters the desert people in the second book, and then at the end of the second book, there's conflagration with the Kush and the Maydu. The Kush are sort of the dominant human people in these books. It seems to be like just larger African tribe. We don't really get African peoples. We don't get anything outside of that, and perhaps that's it. This is a Afrofuturism world where it's quite refreshing to get this thing where we're oh, and I should probably define Afrofuturism. That's basically kind of dealing with the concerns, the scientific, technological, and cultural kind of future of the African diasporic peoples. And indeed, my organization, Nnedi Okorafor, is an American-born woman of two Nigerian Igbo Nigerian parents, and someone who spent a lot of time in Nigeria, and is very much kind of inspired by her travels there and just her own experiences in the world to kind of come up with this very kind of rich, textured thing of, it really feels like this is Africa, African people, African culture, history in the future. And indeed, these histories of violence between the Kush and the Maydu, and how the Himba people, who are the smaller kind of people who seem to be caught in the middle, they're those really lucky people that when two big powers come together, they fight in some smaller poor culture's yard, and destroy everything there versus in their own areas. So things erupt at the very end of the second book, or at least they're threatening to erupt. And this third book is kind of the conflagration of that, and just the further complications. And it's an interesting series, in that things that I start thinking like, oh, this is sort of a fantasy element, then get explained as science fiction. And I do think it's sort of science fiction in the sense of Star Wars kind of science fiction. And I do have to say, I don't want to link this to, I don't want to say this is as poorly done as the Star Wars prequels, but there is a sense of a little bit of metachlorians in these books, where that was like, how do I feel about that? But in some ways, it's used in a way that is it's just further undercutting my expectations and further complicating things. So yes, I'm really not going to get into the events of this book. There's a death which is handled in a way that I'm still kind of dealing with. Like, is this death handled well, or if it had kind of fully kind of had the kind of a less magical or science fiction-y magical ending, what I felt about that. But in some ways, this is about Binti's journey, so I can see why it happened this way. Yeah, so it's one of these series where I would hardly recommend that you go. They're releasing all three books as one novel, and I think that would be a lovely way to experience all this. It'd be interesting to see how this would take as one big gulp, taking all three novels all at once, because I found it actually kind of useful to read one, kind of cogitate over that, read the second, think about that, how I felt about that, and then go on to the third. It's a very, I find it a very rich and dense thing, and dense story. One that I'm definitely I struggle with. I'm still thinking about it. I finished this the Night Masquerade a while ago, but I'm still thinking about it. Yeah, it's one of these books I'm really looking forward to. At some point, I will sit down with all three and read them all through, and just sort of see what that effect is, and whether I can kind of get my head around it more. And I think a part of this is that Nnedi Okorafor is such a good writer. Something like I've read like one of her earlier books, which was Lagoon, which is more of kind of just an alien B movie, like what if aliens invaded, but they happened to invade Lagos, Nigeria, where, versus, doing one of the big major cities. And so it's got a bit of a B movie feel to it, where this is much more, despite its scientific trappings, it's science fiction myth in a way, it feels to me. Science fiction, there's such a rich cultural, a mythical sense to it, all put kind of wrapped up in science fiction-y speech. And indeed, some of the key traditions of some of the peoples in this book is sort of gets explained as, oh, you thought this was magic, but no, it's not actually magic. You can think about the Night Masquerade of the title of this book. It turns out there's a rational explanation, though it's a rational explanation which is a ritualistic explanation, which is like the importance of kind of a ritual of how we frame things, how we cloak things in certain kind of symbology, to help our human brains kind of process them. And I guess I'm still processing it and enjoying the processing. So yes, I would highly recommend checking out this series if you haven't. Yeah, please let me know what you thought of these books in the comments down below if you've read them. So yes, more videos later.